I'm Zeba. I'm delighted to be joined by Blair Kelley. The history that you cover in Black folks spans over 200 years of Black working class, with your own family featured prominently throughout. So I was wondering if you could share the story of how you came to write this book, how your family inspired the research.
Stories that undergird how I understand Black life and Black working life came from my family. And who they were was shaped by that region and about the experiences of their ancestors in bondage and the work that they did after the end of slavery to make a life for themselves, to make community, to build churches and homes, and the ways in which they supported one another. And so the stories that I use in Black folk are stories I heard my whole life. And oftentimes my mom would tell me the same stories over and over and over again. And I would be like, Ma, I know this. And she'd be like, anyway. And she would tell me the same story again. And now I think I know why. It was the first way that I knew what history was. And the courage that Black working people, in spite of racial violence, in spite of segregation, in spite of the legal barriers that prevented them from being citizens and voters to the fullest extent, the ways in which they supported one another and esteemed one another.
As a historian, why did you choose to focus on portraits of individuals as opposed to, this big spanning history that we often get?
We're not relating to the world as one of, several million people who live in our city or have our job. We're thinking about it in terms of our families, our children, our spouses, our homes, and our daily lives. And so I always want to render history in ways that are recognizable to us as people, much more like we would understand a fiction character, and those kinds of stories that are so compelling to us. But I didn't have the luxury of fiction in that I couldn't just make things up. And so I really had to figure out and find and build the texture of their real lives as best I could at this great distance. But for me, that's fun. I think of history as detective work.
You say makes the history of the Black working class different from the generalized history of the working class that we've perhaps read in other books.
The majority of our ancestors did work that people dismissed as menial, but we didn't. And we understood the importance of that work. It helped to upbuild who we are as a community and as a people. You could be a Pullman porter and be seen as a major civil rights advocate. You could be doing anything that required your physical labor, and folks still understood you as someone to look up to and to admire.
You do make a point to shine a spotlight on the role of Black women in the working class community throughout the book. What made these women's roles essential, and why do you think their stories have been previously perhaps overlooked?
I think the story of migration implicitly became, within African-American history, a male story. A story of Black men advocating for access to unions and heavy industrial labor jobs. And those are sort of the traditional works that I read. My grandmother worked as a maid, and I talk about that work after migration. She leaves the South and comes to Philadelphia, and she's thinking she can get an industrial job, and she ends up being a maid for at least a decade. And it's not a story she wanted to tell me. She ended up working at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. And so she talked a lot about that. She was extremely proud of the work that she got to do in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in the Navy Yard. She didn't tell me about the work she had to do to support her family when she first migrated.
I wondered about the impact of migration on I guess the Black working class through Reconstruction, but afterwards, the sort of North-South dichotomy that comes up.
Oftentimes we think of migration as sort of like a one-way and permanent kind of thing. And we don't think about the the connection that people maintain to the South culturally, physically, the visits, the homecoming that they do in the fall. They would, my grandfather would talk about, spending his whole entire paycheck on like a suit and driving home and looking real clean, and people thinking, oh, well, that's how you look every day. And meanwhile, no, that wasn't how he looked every day. But he wanted to show off what he had. And so really that dynamic drove people to want to try to come north. And then they faced hardships in both places. They brought themselves, they brought whole people with them. They brought their culture, the things that they loved, the things that they ate. Their connection to the land didn't go away as they moved north. And so I am excited to write about migration, not just as a labor dynamic, but as a cultural milieu.
What are the lessons or big lesson you hope readers take away from Black folk?
Black people's lives, in granular sense, matter, that they are American stories, that they are substantive to who we are as a country, as citizens, whether or not they were elite or working class. To storytell is such a gift, to learn from each individual person, that those epic tales that we think about for others also live in folks that have been discounted and ignored for so long.
That was one answer. I'll count that as one answer.